What if Vic Vance survived the ambush that happens in the introduction cutscene of Vice City? Many people love Victor, as he's one of the few protagonists that have some sort of morals among the rest, and who's trying to be a good guy in a bad man's game. After the release of Vice City Stories, many people wondered if the man we saw in this opening scene was actually Vic, or the third Vance brother Pete, whose existence is revealed in VCS. However, after a lot of speculations from the fans, Rockstar confirmed at one point that the man we saw was indeed Victor Vance, thus confirming his death, which was sad because, like I said earlier, a lot of people really liked him as a protagonist, and wanted to see more of him. Which brings us to today's question: how would the story of Vice City be affected if Victor had survived the ambush and stayed alive? Or what if instead of Vic, it would have been Lance who got killed instead? We're gonna do a little speculation and talk about all of the possible scenarios that could result because of that. Let's get right into it. I've personally came up with a few possible scenarios, and we're gonna go through the storyline of Vice City and talk about how things would be changed had Vic stayed around for the journey of Tommy Vercetti. In order for the plot of Vice City to not suffer major changes, the deal would obviously still fail, and both parties would still lose the money and the merchandise. The only small difference is Vic managing to somehow duck and avoid getting shot and getting back into Lance's helicopter. Because if you remove the hitman entirely and nothing goes wrong, you'd have to rewrite the storyline in its entirety. After both Vic and Tommy manage to escape with their lives, the missions would look about the same. With Sonny finding out that Harry and Leap, as well as the White Gull, are gone, and Tommy going to Cortez's party to meet him, as well as going to Malibu Club to get information out of Kent Paul about a possible lead. After finding and killing Leo Teal, we would still meet with Lance, and the reason for it is, although in this alternate timeline Vic is alive, Lance would still be looking for those who ambushed the deal so as to get his brother's white lady back. Meaning, Lance would still approach Tommy and ask him to unite their forces and work together, but his motivations for doing so would be slightly different. Okay, fair, but what about Vic? If he's still alive, how would he impact the story? Well, there's more than one way things could go from here. If you know Vic's motivations, he only wanted to get money for his sick brother Pete. And what's strange is that at the end of VCS, Vic initially refuses to assist Lance in selling the 20 keys he's currently got a hold of. So why did he change his mind? It might simply be the case that Lance heavily insisted and begged Vic to do the deal, making it seem like one last big paycheck to set them up for life, so Vic gave in and finally agreed to be part of the deal. So there's a chance that after he barely survives and escapes, Vic could simply decide to leave the city and the life of crime for good, but that wouldn't be the case for Lance, so him leaving Vice City with him is really unlikely. However, there's not many changes that would need to happen to the plot to accommodate this. The most significant change to the plot would probably be the mission Death Row. Seeing as Vic is alive and well, I don't see Lance attempting to go after Diaz the same way he normally does. So Tommy's initial plans to further gain Diaz's trust before taking him out would probably succeed, and it would just prolong Diaz's chain of missions. But beyond that, the rest of the game would look absolutely the same, with Lance still feeling belittled and angry at Tommy for the way he's treated throughout the game. He would still betray and sell him out to Sonny, and he would still end up dead. Not very interesting, is it? Well, that's because having Vic both alive and around for the game's entire duration could majorly change things. Let's say that Vic decides to stick around and assist us along with Lance in finding out who ambushed the deal, and then also have him along for the mission rub-out when we take out Diaz. There's a chance for Vic to stick around and become one of our trusted allies, and seeing how capable he is in VCS, single-handedly building an empire of various businesses, he would probably speed up Tommy's journey of taking over every asset in Vice City, making the second act of the game probably half as long. But what about the final act? Would Lance approach Vic and suggest for the two of them to betray Tommy, keeping everything for themselves? I'd say there's a solid chance for that. But I'm also confident when saying that Vic wouldn't agree with that, as he's not really the type of guy to go around people's backs, unlike his brother. So he would be the middleman between Lance and Tommy and making sure everybody stays in line, impacting the ending as well. Some people suggest that even if Vic would be heavily involved in the story, that Lance's betrayal would still take place and the ending would be somewhat similar. However, I tend to disagree. Lance is many things, and he manages to get both protagonists of VC and VCS in trouble many times. However, he would never go against his brother. You could argue that one of the phone calls in the game where Lance tells Tommy that he's being treated just like his brother would suggests that Lance could get fed up with the both of them and join Sonny's forces in the end regardless. But again, no matter what you think of Lance, he wouldn't backstab his own brother. That much I'm sure of. Whether or not Sonny could figure out that the money is fake and take it with his tail between his legs is a different discussion. At least there on the spot, I mean. But seeing as he wants to expand the operations of the Forellis down south as well, I'm sure he'd still go up against Tommy to take over everything he's built in Vice City for himself. Basically, having Vic around for the duration of Vice City's storyline wouldn't turn it into something completely different, but a few plot points could suffer important changes. And honestly, if that were the real plot, I wouldn't really mind it at all. I'd take it in a heartbeat if it meant keeping Vic alive. But what if instead of having both Vance brothers alive for the plot of Vice City, we could just switch them around? So instead of Vic being the one that's taken out in the ambush, it would be Lance instead. This change would impact the story again, but in a different way. Personally, this is my favorite scenario out of all of them. Firstly, because it eliminates Lance from the start, which would be a dream come true, but also because it means that two of my favorite protagonists could end up working together without any disturbance from Mr. Lance Vance Dance. Things would again play out similarly, but I'm not sure if Tommy and Vic would meet at the same time that him and Lance did in the Mission Back Alley Brawl. But Vic would be extremely motivated to look for the ones responsible, and at one point or another, he would end up crossing paths with Tommy. He would obviously recognize him as the guy he had to deal with and would form a partnership based mostly on Vic's desire to get revenge for his brother and not necessarily to get his merchandise back, unlike Lance. Whether the pair of them would meet up even earlier during the mission The Party, or perhaps later during Guardian Angel, as Tommy and Vic would together protect Diaz's deal, is not really important. But it's obvious that all the missions where we take Lance with us would instead have the protagonist work alongside Vic, or at least up until Rubout, where together they would bring down Diaz in an even more badass end cutscene, having two protagonists around, or at least one and a soon-to-be protagonist, which sounds weird. And then the second act would begin. This is another plot point where things can roll out into different scenarios. Again, taking into account Vic's morals and motivations during his own game, there's a somewhat decent chance that after he takes down Diaz and therefore avenges his brother, he simply gives up the criminal life and lies low, amicably parting ways with Tommy, whose story continues as normal. But since Vic isn't there to assist us now, and Lance is gone, so he doesn't end up selling us out to Sonny at the very end, it's just gonna be a one-on-one standoff between the protagonist and Sonny. Alternatively, Vic decides to stay around and work with Tommy to grow his empire. This one, as well as the other where him, Lance, and Tommy team up, wouldn't make sense, mostly because it would take away from VCS and the story of that game. During 1984, we're playing from Vic's perspective, and while playing through that game, we end up building a relatively big empire for the Vance crime family. Now, the state of his empire in 1986 is kind of non-existent. But the important thing is that making Vic a sidekick for Tommy isn't really the best way to go about it, regardless of how much I love his character. But I think the key takeaway from this video should be that Vic's survival and involvement in the story isn't really necessary, and while I agree with the fact that his death is sad and unfortunate, I don't think he had to be there for the game's plot to be any better. It was already a good plot, mostly borrowing from Scarface with a few twists and changes. I personally think Vic Vance is one of the greatest GTA protagonists ever written, up there with the likes of Nico Bellic and Carl Johnson, showing us there's more to them than just being wacky and unstoppable killing machines on a quest to gain as much money as they possibly can. And I think his death helps us empathize with him even more, knowing that regardless of what we do and no matter how hard we try to fight it, his fate is inevitable, and we can't change it at all. Similar to the story of both John Marston and Arthur Morgan from the Red Dead Redemption games. Now sure, the impact on our hearts and the writing of the characters isn't really on the same level when it comes to Vic Vance and Vice City stories, but I still think it's an amazing attempt of showing us that even the protagonists have weaknesses. I'm not sure how I went from discussing potential what-if scenarios to talking about Vic and other protagonists' writing and character development, but regardless, I hope you found this interesting. And what do you personally think? How would Vic's survival in the ambush affect the story? And how would you imagine the plot continuing from there on? Or perhaps, how would you feel if Lance was the one biting the bullet instead? Let me know in the comment section down below. And while you're there, also leave a like. And of course, consider subscribing if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching.